In occupied rural France, a wounded American paratrooper was about to bleed out in a secluded garden. A routine combat jump turned deadly when German anti-aircraft fire scattered his unit across miles of enemy territory. Sergeant James Holloway wasn't your typical farm boy from Ohio. For years, he was United States Army Airborne, known for his exceptional marksmanship that could drop targets at distances others thought impossible. When Nazi forces intensified their hunt for Allied soldiers, they had no idea they were pursuing a man who would become the Resistance's deadliest ghost. Holloway's strategic alliance with local fighter Marie Fournier would trigger a resistance movement that would disrupt German operations throughout the region. What began as a desperate struggle for survival would become a personal war against oppression. The small French village would never be the same after a wounded American and a determined Frenchwoman transformed into the Nazis' worst nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The night air rushed past Sergeant James Holloway's face as he plummeted through darkness. The roar of aircraft engines faded above him, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the whistle of wind through his parachute straps. The drop had gone wrong from the start. German anti-aircraft fire more concentrated than intelligence had indicated, the pilot forced to take evasive action, the jump order given in panic rather than precision. Jesus Christ, Jim muttered as his body spun, disorienting him further. He could see nothing but vague shadows below, the French countryside a black void promising either sanctuary or death. His stomach lurched as he realized how scattered his unit must be. The plan had called for a tight drop zone, men landing within meters of each other before regrouping to strike a German communications post. Now, who knew where anyone had landed? The first bullet punched through his parachute, canopy with a sound like canvas tearing. The second found flesh, tearing through his left side just above his hip. The impact sent him swinging violently beneath his chute. Hot pain bloomed across his torso as blood began soaking his jumpsuit. Shit! Shit! Jim hissed, biting down on his lip to keep from screaming. Gunfire continued to pepper the night sky. Germans, firing blindly upward at the paratroopers they knew were descending. Through gritted teeth, Jim fought to control his descent, pulling on his risers to direct himself away from the muzzle flashes below. The trees came up faster than expected. His boots barely cleared a massive oak before his parachute canopy snagged in the upper branches, jerking him to a halt 15 feet above the ground. The sudden stop sent a fresh wave of agony through his wounded side. Jim dangled, spinning slowly, blood dripping from his boots to the forest floor below. The distant crack of rifle fire and shouted German commands told him that patrols were already hunting survivors. With shaking hands, Jim reached for his jump knife. He needed to cut himself down before a patrol passed beneath him, but each movement sent fresh pain radiating from his wound. Steady, he whispered to himself, the farm boy from Ohio trying to remember his training. One thing at a time. He slashed at the risers, keeping his body as still as possible to minimize the swinging. The knife's blade reflected moonlight filtering through leaves as he sawed through the cords. The final strand gave way with a snap and Jim plummeted. He hit the ground hard, his attempt at a proper landing roll compromised by his injury. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent white-hot lightning through his left side. For a long moment he lay motionless among the fallen leaves and underbrush, struggling to breathe through the pain. Above him, his parachute billowed, like a pale ghost caught in the branches. German voices approached, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Jim forced himself to move, dragging his body beneath the thick undergrowth of a nearby shrub. His hand pressed against his side came away slick with blood. 5 German soldiers passed within meters of his hiding spot, their boots crunching on fallen branches. Jim held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly he feared they would hear it. One soldier paused, his flashlight beam sweeping across the ground near Jim's position. The sergeant remained perfectly still, years of hunting in Ohio forests serving him well now. "Nichts here," the soldier eventually called to his comrades. "Lass uns weitergehen." The patrol moved on, but Jim knew they'd return once they spotted. His parachute caught in the trees. He needed to move to find his unit or at least get clear of the immediate search area. Gritting his teeth, he crawled from his hiding place and assessed his situation. His Thompson submachine gun was still strapped to his chest, miraculously undamaged in the fall. His canteen was intact, and he still had his field kit. But the wound in his side wouldn't stop bleeding, and he had no idea where the rest of his stick had landed. The mission brief had included the names of several French resistance contacts in the region, but without knowing exactly where he'd landed, that information was nearly useless. Jim oriented himself using the North Star, then began moving west, away from the German patrol and, he hoped, toward friendly territory. Each step was agony, his side burning with fresh pain. Blood continued to seep through his fingers as he clutched his wound. "Just keep moving," he muttered to himself, his breath fogging in the cool night air. One foot in front of the other, for hours he staggered through the forest, pausing occasionally to rest and listen for pursuit. The sky gradually lightened from black to deep blue as dawn approached. Through breaks in the trees, he could make out rolling hills, and in the distance, what appeared to be a small village, a cluster of stone buildings with slate roofs nestled in a valley. Jim's vision blurred. He'd lost too much blood, and the adrenaline that had kept him moving was beginning to fade. He knew he needed shelter and medical attention soon, or he wouldn't live to see another sunset. The forest eventually gave way to farmland, fields of wheat swaying gently in the pre-dawn breeze. Jim kept to the hedgerows and ditches, avoiding open ground where he might be spotted. His training screamed at him to avoid civilization, to hide and wait for extraction. But the wound in his side told a different story. Without help, he was a dead man. As the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern hills, Jim reached the outskirts of the village. Stone cottages with thatched roofs stood silent, smoke curling from a few chimneys. A weathered farmhouse stood apart from the others, partially hidden by a copse of apple trees. Something about its isolated position called to Jim. Perhaps it offered a chance of shelter without immediately alerting the entire village to his presence. He dragged himself toward it, his legs finally giving out as he reached the edge of a small kitchen garden behind the house. Jim collapsed among rows of vegetables, his blood staining the soil dark. The world spun around him as he fought to remain conscious. The sound of a door opening barely registered in his fading awareness. Soft footsteps approached, then stopped. Through half-closed eyes, Jim made out the blurry figure of a woman standing over him. "American," he managed to whisper, gesturing weakly to the Wings emblem on his uniform. "Please." A pistol materialized in the woman's hand, aimed steadily at his head. Her face was hard, suspicious, dark eyes studying him with an intensity that cut through his delirium. "Marie, non." A harsh whisper came from the doorway of the farmhouse. A man appeared, thin and wiry, his face narrow and alert like that of the animal that had earned him his nickname. "Tu ne peux pas le garder ici. C'est trop dangereux." "Je sais, Pierre," the woman, Marie, replied, her voice low but firm. She never took her eyes off Jim, the pistol remaining rock-steady in her grip. "Mais il est blessé et il est un allié. Un allié qui va nous faire tuer." Pierre hissed, glancing nervously toward the village. Jim couldn't follow their rapid French, but he understood the tension in their voices. His life hung in the balance of their decision. With the last of his strength, he reached into his pocket and withdrew his dog tags, letting them dangle from blood-stained fingers. "Holloway," he whispered. "Sergeant. United States Army. Please." Marie knelt beside him, the pistol still trained on him as she examined his wound with her free hand. Her touch was gentle but clinical, assessing the damage with practiced efficiency. "The Germans will be searching," she said in accented English. "If we help you, we risk everything. Why should I not shoot you now and save us all the trouble?" Despite the agony clouding his thoughts, Jim recognized the test in her words. She was weighing him, deciding if he was worth the risk. "Because," he managed to say, "you're fighting the same enemy I am, and because I can help you fight them." Something shifted in Marie's expression, not softening exactly, but a calculation being made. "Pierre," she called without looking back. "Help me. Get him inside, quickly." "To a fall," Pierre muttered, but moved to Jim's other side all the same. Together they lifted the wounded paratrooper, half dragging him toward the farmhouse. Jim fought to stay conscious, knowing that passing out now might mean never waking again. "I need your word," Marie said as they maneuvered him through the narrow doorway. "If I save your life, you fight for us. For France. No running back to your army at the first chance." Through the haze of pain, Jim met her gaze. In her eyes, he saw not just determination but a fire, the kind that came from having lost too much to give ground now. "My word," he whispered as darkness began closing in around the edges of his vision. "But you should know. I'm a soldier. Following orders is what I do." "Not anymore," Marie replied as Jim's consciousness finally slipped away. "Now, you're a ghost, and ghosts follow no orders but their own." Consciousness returned to Jim Holloway in fragments. First pain, sharp and insistent along his left side, then the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, and finally sound, hushed voices arguing in rapid French somewhere above him. He forced his eyes open to darkness, broken only by thin shafts of light filtering through wooden floorboards overhead. He lay on a narrow cot in what appeared to be a cellar, its stone walls glistening with moisture. Jim attempted to sit up, a decision his body immediately protested. He fell back with a grunt that silenced the voices above. Footsteps crossed the floor and a trapdoor opened, spilling light into his underground sanctuary. Marie descended the rough wooden steps, her expression neutral as she carried a steaming bowl. "You're awake," she said, setting the bowl on a small table beside his cot. "Good. I was beginning to wonder if I'd wasted my medicine." Jim winced as he propped himself up on his elbows. "How long?" "3 days," Marie replied, checking the bandages wrapped tightly around his torso. "The bullet went through clean, but you lost much blood. You're lucky, a few centimeters to the right, and we wouldn't be having this conversation." Memory flooded back. The drop, the gunfire, the long stumble through unfamiliar woods. Jim glanced around the cellar, noting the shelves of preserved foods, wine bottles, and a small cache of weapons partially concealed behind a false wall. "This your headquarters?" he asked, voice still rough from disuse. A hint of a smile touched Marie's lips. "One of several. We move frequently. Necessity in our line of work." She gestured to the bowl. "Eat. It's not much, but food is scarce these days." The soup was thin, mostly broth with a few vegetables and indeterminate meat, but it was the best thing Jim had tasted in months. As he ate, the trapdoor opened again, and Pierre descended, his narrow face taut with tension. "Dietrich's men executed the Rousseau family this morning," he said without preamble, addressing Marie as if Jim weren't present. "Public in the square. The father, mother, both sons." Marie's face hardened. "What was their crime?" "The official charge was hiding weapons for terrorists," Pierre spat the word. "But everyone knows Claude Rousseau did nothing more than refuse to surrender his family's bread delivery truck for German use. And now Dietrich has 4 more deaths to add to his collection," Marie said softly, her hands clenching into fists. Jim watched the exchange silently, recognizing the name. "Dietrich," he ventured. "Gestapo?" Pierre turned to him, eyes narrowing. "Captain Klaus Dietrich, previously Berlin's most efficient hunter of communists, now tasked with eliminating resistance in our region. He's been here 3 months and has executed 27 civilians." Pierre's gaze bore into Jim. "And you, American, have just made our situation more dangerous. If they find you here—" "They won't," Marie cut him off. "Not if we're careful." She turned to Jim. "Can you walk?" Jim nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. "I think so. Why?" "Because we can't keep you in the village indefinitely. Eventually someone will talk. Fear or carelessness, it makes no difference. The result is the same." Her eyes met his. "We need to decide what to do with you," Pierre scoffed. "We should have left him where we found him. And yet we didn't," Marie replied sharply. "That decision is made. Now we deal with the consequences. She helped Jim to his feet, supporting him, as he swayed slightly. Tonight you'll meet someone else who might help us determine your future. That evening, wearing borrowed civilian clothes that hung loose on his frame, Jim sat at the small table in the farmhouse kitchen. His wound throbbed dully, painful, but no longer the all-consuming agony of days prior. Marie worked silently at the stove while Pierre kept watch at the window, his nervous energy filling the room like static electricity. A soft knock at the door sent Pierre reaching for his pistol. Marie gestured for him to wait, then approached the door. "Who seeks shelter from the storm?" she asked. "One who remembers sunshine," came the reply, clearly a code phrase. Marie opened the door to admit a tall, thin man in a priest's cassock. Silver-haired and solemn-faced, he carried a small basket covered with a cloth. His eyes immediately found Jim, assessing him with quiet intensity. "So this is our American visitor," the priest said, his English accented but clear. "I am Father Henri de la Croix." He set the basket on the table, revealing bread, cheese, and a small bottle of wine. "Not much, I'm afraid, but God provides what he can in difficult times." "Thank you, Father," Jim said, strangely comforted by the presence of a man of the cloth, though he'd never been particularly religious. "I appreciate the risk you're taking." Father Henri's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We all take risks in war, Sergeant Holloway. Some by choice, others by necessity." He turned to Marie. "Will you allow us a moment alone? I'd like to speak with our guest." Marie hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. Then we have matters to discuss." She and Pierre stepped outside, leaving Jim alone with the priest. Henri waited until the door closed before speaking again, his voice lower now. "Your presence here places them in grave danger. You understand this, yes?" Jim nodded. "I didn't ask to crash land in their backyard, Father. No one asks for war. Yet here we are." Henri leaned forward. "Captain Dietrich is not like other German officers. He's methodical, patient, a hunter who studies his prey before striking. Already there are rumors of an American soldier hidden in the countryside. It's only a matter of time before he connects these whispers to this village." "What are you suggesting?" Jim asked. "That I turn myself in?" Henri shook his head. "I suggest you recover quickly and move on. These people," he gestured to the door where Marie had exited, "they fight because they must, because this is their home. You still have a chance to rejoin your people, to fight another day." "And if I can't?" Jim asked. "My unit could be anywhere, captured, killed, or hundreds of kilometers away by now." The priest's eyes softened. "Then you do what soldiers have done since time immemorial. You adapt. You survive." He rose to his feet. "But do not stay here out of some misplaced sense of debt. Marie Fournier saves lives because it is who she is, not because she collects obligations." Before Jim could respond, the door opened and Marie returned. Something in her expression had changed, a new tension visible in the set of her jaw. "We must go," she said urgently. "German patrols are moving through the village, searching houses." "Father," Henri stood calmly, "I should return to the church. My absence would be noted." "Be careful," Marie warned. "Dietrich was asking questions at the Moreau farm. He seems particularly interested in recent deliveries of fuel to the region." The priest nodded grimly. "God be with you all." He squeezed Jim's shoulder once before departing, his tall figure disappearing into the gathering dusk. Marie immediately began gathering essential items into a small pack. "We have a safe house 2 kilometers north of here. We'll move under cover of darkness." "What about the operation tonight?" Pierre asked from the doorway, his voice tense. Marie paused, conflict evident on her face. "We proceed as planned. The supplies in that convoy are too valuable to ignore." Jim struggled to his feet. "What operation?" Pierre and Marie exchanged glances, a silent debate playing out between them. Finally, Marie spoke. "A German supply convoy passes the eastern road tonight. 6 trucks carrying ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies intended for the front. Her eyes met Jim's. We intend to ensure those supplies never reach their destination. With what? Jim asked. What weapons do you have? Enough, Pierre answered, curtly. This isn't your concern, American. Jim looked between them. You saved my life, let me help. You can barely stand, Marie observed coolly. I can shoot, Jim countered. And I'm guessing you could use another gun. A long silence followed, broken finally by Pierre's bitter laugh. We're trusting our operation to a half-dead American we found bleeding in our garden. This is madness. And yet, Marie said softly, madness may be exactly what we need. She turned to Jim. Can you handle a rifle? Not your Thompson. Too noisy, too distinctive. Jim nodded. Give me a sight line and a stable position. I won't let you down. 2 hours. Later, night had fallen completely over the French countryside. Jim lay prone on a small ridge overlooking a winding country road, a battered hunting rifle pressed against his shoulder. His wound protested the position, but he pushed the pain aside, focusing instead on controlling his breathing as he'd been taught. Below, Marie and 2 other resistance fighters Jim hadn't been introduced to were setting charges at a sharp bend in the road. Pierre maintained watch 50 meters down the road, prepared to signal when the convoy approached. Jim scanned the area through the rifle's iron sights, noting potential problems. The moon was too bright for his liking, casting silver light across the landscape. If German scouts preceded the convoy, the saboteurs would be dangerously exposed. His finger rested lightly outside the trigger guard, his mind calculating distances and angles as he'd done countless times before. A low whistle came from Pierre's position. 1-minute warning. Marie and her companions quickly finished arming. Their explosive devices then melted back into the woods. The plan was simple. The lead truck would hit the charges, blocking the road. In the confusion, the resistance fighters would toss Molotov cocktails into the remaining vehicles, then disappear before reinforcements could arrive. Simple, but dangerous, and reliant on perfect timing. The rumble of engines grew louder. Jim steadied his breathing, focusing on the curve in the road. The first set of headlights appeared, the German transport truck moving at a cautious pace in the darkness. Jim's instincts flared an instant before the ambush began. A flash of movement in the trees opposite his position, a German patrol, previously unseen, moving to intercept the saboteurs. Trap, he whispered uselessly, too far to warn Marie. Below, the lead truck rolled over the planted explosives. The detonation ripped through the night, a flash of orange flame followed by a thunderous boom that echoed across the countryside. The truck careened off the road, its front axle shattered, effectively blocking the narrow passage. But even as Marie and her team moved to attack the remaining vehicles, German soldiers emerged from the woods, rifles blazing. The resistance fighters found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire, pinned down behind the wreckage of the lead truck. Jim didn't hesitate. His first shot took a German soldier high in the chest, dropping him instantly. His second found another target, an officer shouting orders from the tree line. 3 more shots, 3 more Germans down. Jim worked the bolt smoothly between each shot, his training overriding both pain and doubt. Below, Marie seized the moment, leading her team in a dash toward the remaining trucks. Pierre appeared from his position, providing covering fire as they tossed their makeshift incendiaries into the German vehicles. Flames erupted as the bottles broke, gasoline igniting with a whoosh. Jim continued firing, methodically eliminating German soldiers attempting to flank the resistance fighters. His world narrowed to the rifle sights. Breathe, aim, squeeze, breathe. Each shot precisely placed. When his rifle clicked empty, Jim counted 7 German soldiers dead by his hand, with at least 3 more wounded. Below, 4 of the 6 trucks were now engulfed in flames, their cargo destroyed. Marie was organizing a fighting retreat, her team falling back toward the ridgeline where Jim was positioned. He struggled to his feet, pain lancing through his side, and stumbled down to meet them. Pierre was supporting one of the other fighters, a young man with a bullet wound in his leg. This way, Jim called, indicating a path through the dense underbrush that would shield them from pursuit. Single file, keep low. Marie hesitated only, briefly before following his lead, her face smudged with soot and grim determination. The small band moved quickly through the forest, the sounds of German shouts fading behind them. It was nearly an hour before they reached the safe house, a shepherd's hut abandoned since the war began, hidden in a small valley. Once inside, Marie immediately began treating the wounded fighter's leg while Pierre secured the perimeter. "How did they know?" Marie finally asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "That patrol was waiting for us." "Someone talked," Pierre spat. "We have a traitor, or they've been watching the road," Jim suggested. "That bend is an obvious ambush point. They might have been setting traps like that all along their supply routes." Marie finished bandaging the young fighter's leg, then turned to Jim. Her eyes traveled to his side, where a dark stain was spreading across his borrowed shirt. "You've reopened your wound," she observed. Jim glanced down, surprised by the amount of blood. The adrenaline of combat had masked the pain until now. "Worth it," he said simply. 7 soldiers, Pierre said quietly. "I counted. 7 with a hunting rifle from that distance." He didn't sound hostile anymore, merely thoughtful, reassessing. "I told you I could shoot," Jim replied, accepting the cloth Marie handed him to press against his seeping wound. A silence fell over the group, broken only by the soft moans of the wounded fighter. Finally Marie spoke, her voice carrying a new weight. "You saved our lives tonight," she said. "Whatever debt you thought you owed for saving yours, consider it paid." Jim met her gaze steadily. "I didn't do it to clear a debt." "Why then?" she challenged. Jim considered his answer carefully. "Because it was the right thing to do. Because those supplies would have killed Allied soldiers, my countrymen." He paused. "And because you're fighting the same enemy I am." Marie studied him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Finally, she reached into her pack and withdrew a folded map. "The Allied front is approximately 80 kilometers southwest of here," she said, spreading the map between them. "If you wish to rejoin your forces, we can arrange guides to help you cross German lines. It would be dangerous, but possible." Jim looked at the map, seeing the route she indicated, a path back to the world he knew, to his unit and the clear chain of command he'd lived by for years. Then he looked at the faces around him, Marie's quiet intensity, Pierre's wary respect, the wounded fighter whose name he still didn't know. "And if I stay?" he asked quietly. Pierre scoffed. "You would fight with us? For what? This isn't your country, American." "No," Jim agreed. "But freedom should belong to all countries, shouldn't it?" He looked back to Marie. "Besides, you said it yourself, I'm a ghost now. Maybe that's exactly what your resistance needs." Marie's lips curved in a slight smile, the first genuine one he'd seen from her. "We don't offer safety," she warned. "We can't even promise survival." "Neither can the U.S. Army," Jim replied. "At least here, I know who I'm fighting for." "I can see the difference it makes." Marie extended her hand. "Then welcome to the resistance, Sergeant Holloway." As Jim clasped her hand, he knew he was crossing a line, from soldier following orders to something else entirely. Whatever awaited him on this path, he would face it not as Sergeant James Holloway of the United States Army, but simply as Jim, a man making his own choices for the first time in years. "So," he said, "what's our next move?" Sunrise found Jim perched on a wooden stool in Marie's kitchen, cleaning the hunting rifle that had proved so valuable during their ambush. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory guiding each motion despite the persistent ache in his side. 2 weeks had passed since the convoy attack, and though his wound was healing well, the occasional sharp pain reminded him of how close he'd come to death. The farmhouse door swung open, admitting a gust of cool morning air along with Marie. She carried a basket of vegetables from the garden, her face flushed from exertion. "Any news?" Jim asked, not looking up from his work. "The Germans doubled patrols on the eastern road," Marie replied, setting the basket on the table. 2 more. Families were arrested in Beaumont last night, suspected of aiding the resistance." Jim nodded grimly. This had become their morning ritual. Marie gathering intelligence during her early rounds of the village, Jim preparing their weapons for whatever the day might bring. They moved around each other with the comfortable familiarity of soldiers who had fought together, yet Jim sensed an invisible barrier that Marie maintained between them. "What about supplies?" he asked, reassembling the rifle with smooth, precise movements. Marie sighed. "Running low. Ammunition especially. The Germans are watching the black market closely now." She began washing the vegetables in a basin of water, her back to him. "Pierre believes he has a contact in Saint-André who might help, but it's risky. Dietrich has informants everywhere." Jim finally looked up, studying her profile. The mention of Pierre brought a familiar tension to her shoulders. The wiry Frenchman had proven surprisingly accepting of Jim's presence after the convoy ambush, though his skepticism occasionally resurfaced. "We could try for an airdrop," Jim suggested, not for the first time. "If I could get a message to Allied command and reveal our position to everyone within 50 kilometers. Marie shook her head. "Too dangerous. We survive by being invisible, Jim." The sound of running footsteps interrupted them. Both reached instinctively for weapons, Jim's hand closing around the rifle, Marie's finding the pistol hidden beneath her apron. The door burst open to reveal a girl of about 14. Her dark hair tied back in a messy braid, eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. "Marie!" she exclaimed, breathless. "The Germans are posting new announcements in the square. Something about ration changes and—" She stopped abruptly, noticing Jim. Her expression shifted from surprise to intense curiosity. "So it's true. The American is still here." "Colette," Marie said sharply, "I told you to stay away from the farmhouse." Jim looked between them, noting the family resemblance. The same determined set of the jaw, the same intelligent dark eyes. Marie had mentioned a sister but had offered no details. Colette ignored her sister's reprimand, approaching Jim with unabashed interest. "Are you really a paratrooper? Did you kill many Germans during the ambush? Pierre says you shoot like a ghost." "Enough!" Marie snapped, tension evident in every line of her body. "What else did you see in the village?" Colette's excitement dimmed slightly at her sister's tone. "Captain Dietrich received a visitor. An officer from Paris, I think. They're staying at the mayor's house and—" She lowered her voice dramatically. "They've brought in another Gestapo agent. A woman. I heard she specializes in interrogations." Jim watched Marie's face pale slightly at this news. The introduction of specialized interrogators suggested the Germans were escalating their hunt for the resistance. "How do you know all this?" Jim asked Colette gently. The girl's face brightened with pride. "I listen. No one notices a girl delivering eggs or mending clothes. The Germans talk freely around me. They think I don't understand." "She's our best intelligence gatherer," Marie admitted reluctantly. "Though it's a role I've tried to discourage." Colette rolled her eyes with all the dramatic flair of adolescence. "The war doesn't spare children, Marie. You know that better than anyone." Something unspoken passed between the sisters, a shared history Jim could sense but not decipher. Marie's expression softened momentarily, then hardened again with resolve. "Go to Father Henri," she instructed Colette. "Tell him about the new Gestapo agent. Then go straight home and stay there, understand?" The girl nodded, though Jim suspected the instruction would be only partially followed. She turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Jim. "Are you going to help us kill the Germans?" she asked, with disturbing directness. Before Jim could formulate a response, Marie ushered her sister out, speaking rapid French too low for him to catch. He heard Colette's indignant reply, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. When Marie returned, her face was tight with worry. "She's too reckless," she muttered, more to herself than to Jim. "Too eager to prove herself." "She reminds me of you," Jim observed quietly. Marie's sharp glance held a warning. "You don't know me well enough to make such comparisons." "Maybe not," Jim conceded. "But I've been here long enough to recognize courage when I see it, and to know it runs in your family." Marie turned away, busying herself with the vegetables, but not before Jim caught the flicker of emotion across her face. For a moment, the carefully maintained barrier between them thinned. "Your sister mentioned killing Germans," Jim ventured after a moment. Is there an operation I should know about? Marie remained silent for so long that Jim thought she might not answer. Finally, she set down the knife she'd been using and faced him. The officer from Paris, she said, her voice carefully controlled. He's not just visiting. He's here to oversee the expansion of German operations in the region. More supply convoys, more troops moving through our territory. Makes sense, Jim nodded. With the Allies pushing from the south, they need to reinforce their positions. This officer, Colonel Wagner, he's known for his efficiency and his cruelty. Marie's hands clenched into fists at her sides. 3 months ago, he ordered the execution of 78 civilians in a village near Bordeaux as punishment for a single German soldier's death. Jim felt a chill despite the morning sunlight streaming through the window. And you're planning to kill him? Not just planning, Marie replied. The decision is made. The operation is set for tomorrow night. Jim set the rifle aside and rose, to his feet, ignoring the twinge in his side. That's suicide, Marie. This Wagner will be heavily guarded, especially with Dietrich already on high alert for resistance activity. It must be done, she insisted. If he establishes a command center, here our entire network will be compromised. There are other ways to disrupt his operations, Jim argued. Sabotage, misinformation. This is not up for debate, Marie cut him off, fire in her eyes. Wagner dies tomorrow night. The only question is whether you stand with us or not. Jim studied her, recognizing that the steel in her voice went deeper than military necessity. This is personal for you, he said quietly. Why? Marie held his gaze for a long moment, then abruptly turned away. Be ready at sundown, she said over her shoulder. Pierre will brief you on your role, if you choose to have one. She left without another word, the door closing firmly behind. Her twilight cast long shadows across the farmyard as Jim helped Pierre load supplies into an ancient Citroën truck with a false bottom built into its bed. Neither man spoke much. Their working relationship built more on grudging respect than friendship. The silence was broken only by the soft clank of weapons being secured beneath the hidden compartment. She won't tell me why this mission matters so much to her, Jim finally said, passing Pierre another box of ammunition. Pierre paused, his weathered face unreadable in the fading light. It's not my story to tell, he replied after a moment. I need to know what I'm fighting for, Jim pressed. What she's fighting for. Pierre secured the last crate and closed the false compartment with practiced efficiency. When he straightened, his expression had softened slightly. When the Germans first came, he said quietly, most people thought cooperation was the best path to survival. Marie's parents disagreed. They were teachers, intellectuals who understood what Nazi occupation truly meant. Jim leaned against the truck, listening intently. They began collecting information, troop movement, supply schedules, and passing it to the early resistance networks. For nearly a year, they operated undetected. Pierre's voice grew tight. Then someone betrayed them. Someone in the village they trusted. Dietrich? Jim asked. Pierre shook his head. Dietrich came later. It was Wagner who ordered their arrest, his first assignment in France. He made a public example of them. Pierre's eyes grew distant with the memory. He gathered the entire village to witness their execution. Marie and Colette were forced to watch. Jim closed his eyes briefly, the pieces falling into place. How long ago? 2 years, Pierre replied. Marie was 22, studying in Paris. Colette was only 12. He sighed heavily. After their parents' deaths, Marie could have taken Colette and fled to unoccupied territory. Instead, she returned to the village and built the resistance. Network from nothing. Every operation, every act of sabotage, it's all been leading to this moment. Revenge won't bring her parents back, Jim said quietly. This isn't just about revenge, Pierre countered. Wagner returning is a military threat to everything we've built. But yes, for Marie it's also personal, and perhaps it should be. This war became personal the moment the Germans crossed our borders. Jim nodded slowly, understanding settling like a weight on his shoulders. I'm in, he said simply. Whatever the plan is, I'll do my part. Good, Pierre replied. Because we'll need your shooting skills. Wagner is staying at the mayor's residence, heavily guarded as you predicted. But tomorrow evening, he's scheduled to inspect the new command post they're establishing in the old winery. There's a moment, perhaps only seconds, when he'll be exposed during the transfer from his car to the building entrance. One shot, Jim mused. From how far? 300 meters at least. Any closer and the German patrols will spot you. Jim whistled softly. Difficult, but not impossible. I'll need a better rifle than the hunting piece, though. Something with range and accuracy. Already arranged, Pierre assured him. We have a Kar 98K taken from a German sniper last year. Not your American Springfield, but it should serve. A small figure emerged from the shadows of the barn. Colette, her expression solemn. Marie wants to see you, she said to Jim. In the orchard. Pierre and Jim exchanged glances. Go, Pierre said. I'll finish here. Jim followed Colette through the twilight toward the small apple orchard behind the farmhouse. The girl moved silently, her earlier exuberance replaced by a watchful calm that seemed beyond her years. You know about the mission tomorrow, she stated rather than asked. Yes, Jim replied. Will you protect her? Colette stopped suddenly, turning to face him. Marie thinks she needs to do everything alone, that she needs to protect everyone else, but sometimes... She hesitated, searching for words. Sometimes she needs someone to watch over her too. The simple plea from this child woman struck Jim more deeply than he expected. I'll do everything I can, he promised. Colette studied him, then nodded once, apparently satisfied. She's by the old stone wall, she said, pointing deeper into the orchard before disappearing back toward the house. Jim continued alone, the evening air heavy with the scent of apples and approaching rain. He found Marie seated on a weathered stone wall staring out across the darkening fields. She didn't turn as he approached, though he knew she heard him. Pierre told me about your parents, he said, sitting beside her. About Wagner. Marie's profile remained impassive, but her hands tightened in her lap. Pierre talks too much. He cares about you. They all do. Jim paused. So do I. Now she turned to look at him, her expression guarded. You barely know me. I know enough, Jim replied. I know you're fighting not just for revenge, but for your sister, your village, your country. I know you're willing to die for that fight if necessary. Are you trying to talk me out of tomorrow's mission? Her voice carried a warning edge. No. Jim shook his head. I'm in. 100%. But I want you to understand something. He turned to face her fully. This isn't just your fight anymore, it's mine too. Not because of some debt or military duty, but because I choose it. Because it matters. Something shifted in Marie's expression. A softening. A momentary glimpse of the woman beneath the resistance leader's armor. They made them kneel, she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. In the town square. In the rain. My father, first then my mother. Her eyes grew distant with the memory. Wagner read the charges himself, treason against the Reich. My father tried to look at us one last time, but a soldier struck him with a rifle butt. Her voice remained steady, but tears gathered in her eyes. My mother was praying when they shot her. Jim reached for her hand, half expecting her to pull away. She didn't. I had to cover Colette's eyes, Marie continued. But I watched. I made myself watch every second. And I promised them, promised myself, that one day Wagner would face the same judgment he delivered so coldly. And he will, Jim assured her. Tomorrow night we'll make sure of it. Marie turned to him, something vulnerable and fierce in her gaze. If something goes wrong, if I don't return, promise me you'll get Colette to safety. To Switzerland. Or Spain, anywhere beyond German reach. Nothing's going to happen to you, Jim insisted. I won't let it. A sad smile touched Marie's lips. Such American certainty, she murmured. As if determination alone can change the course of war. It's not just determination, Jim replied. It's skill, planning, and having people you trust at your back. He squeezed her hand gently. I've got your back, Marie. tomorrow and every day after until this war is over. For a long moment they sat in silence, hands joined, the weight of tomorrow's mission hanging between them. Finally, Marie leaned slightly against his shoulder, the gesture so subtle it might have been unconscious. "My parents would have liked you," she said softly. "My father always admired pragmatism tempered with principle." "High praise," Jim smiled. "I wish I could have met them." "In a way, you fight alongside them every day," Marie replied. "Their courage lives on in what we do." She straightened, her moment of vulnerability passing. "We should return. There's much to prepare before tomorrow." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Jim felt something shift between them. Not romantic exactly, but a deepening of trust, a recognition of shared purpose that transcended their different backgrounds. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The next evening came too quickly. Jim lay prone on the slate roof of an abandoned tannery, the Kar 98K rifle steady in his hands. 320 meters away stood the old winery, now converted into a German command post. German soldiers patrolled the perimeter while officers and administrative staff bustled in and out of the main entrance. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn broke over the village, pale light seeping through the cracked windows of the abandoned mill where Jim and Marie had taken refuge. They sat at a rickety table, studying a crude map of the village police station where Pierre was being held. "Dietrich won't keep him there long," Marie said, her voice rough from exhaustion. "Once he realizes what Pierre knows, he'll transfer him to Gestapo headquarters in Lyon. We'll never get him out then." Jim studied the schematic. 4 guards at the entrance, unknown number inside. "If we create a diversion here, draw the outside. Guards away, we might be able to slip in through the front." "We need more people," Marie said. "2 of us can't do this alone." "Who can we trust? If Pierre's talked—" "He wouldn't," Marie insisted, though doubt shadowed her eyes. "Not yet." A noise from outside silenced them. Jim reached for his pistol, while Marie moved to the window. "It's Colette," she whispered. Marie's sister slipped inside, her face smudged with dirt, clothes torn at the knees. "I couldn't get through. Germans everywhere," she explained. From her pocket she withdrew a folded paper. "I thought you might need this." Marie unfolded it to reveal a detailed diagram of the police station. "Where did you get this?" "From Father, Henri. He said Pierre is being held in the rear cell, the one that used to be the file room. There are 8 Germans inside, 6 regular police and 2 Gestapo. Dietrich comes and goes." A firm knock at the door cut her off. Jim positioned himself beside the entrance, pistol drawn. "Who's there?" Marie called softly. "A shepherd seeking lost lambs," came the reply, a resistance code phrase. Marie opened the door to reveal Father Henri, his tall frame stooped with exhaustion. "I see Colette found you," he said, spotting the diagram. "Time is short." "What do you know about Pierre?" Marie asked. "He's alive, but Dietrich is personally overseeing his interrogation. I heard Pierre screaming as I passed the station this morning." Henri removed his glasses, cleaning them wearily. "Dietrich is bringing in villagers one by one, comparing their statements, looking for inconsistencies. We need to move quickly," Marie said. "Tonight, before Pierre gives him anything concrete." "There's more," Henri added. "Dietrich plans to transfer Pierre to Lyon tomorrow morning. A special Gestapo unit is being sent, experts in extracting information." Henri offered to create a diversion during an evening visit to Pierre. Despite Marie's concerns for his safety, the priest insisted. "When the Germans first came, I kept silent. That silence cost lives, including your parents. I will not make the same mistake again." By dusk, Jim, Marie, and 3 resistance fighters, Etienne, Michel, and Lucille, had positioned themselves near the police station. Their plan was simple but dangerous. Henri would create a distraction inside while Michel and Lucille set off a small explosion in the marketplace to draw away the guards. Once we're inside, Jim instructed, move fast but not carelessly. Most of the Germans will be in the main office area. Pierre is being held in the rear cell block. On schedule, an explosion shattered the silence from the marketplace. Two of the 4 guards at the entrance ran toward the disturbance. Inside the station, something crashed loudly. Henri's distraction. Now, Marie hissed. They moved with practiced coordination. Jim subdued one guard while Etienne took down the other. Inside, Henri had knocked over a filing cabinet, creating enough chaos for them to slip unnoticed down a side corridor. But when they reached the cells, all were empty, except for one containing a terrified villager. Basement, Jim said, remembering Marie's mention of a secure interrogation room. They found Pierre strapped to a metal chair in the basement, his face bloody but conscious. Cutting it close, he rasped as Etienne freed him. Can you walk? Jim asked. If the alternative is staying here, I can fly, Pierre replied. With no sign of Dietrich, they moved quickly back the way they came, subduing 2 more guards in the main office before escaping into the night. German shouts erupted behind them as they fled through the darkened village toward the church. Father Henri was waiting at the side entrance. He ushered them inside and revealed a hidden trapdoor by the altar, leading to an ancient crypt below. I must remain, Henri said when Jim asked if he was coming. My absence would only confirm my involvement. The Germans will question you, Marie warned. I will handle it, Henri assured her with quiet confidence. God will give me strength. The trapdoor closed, plunging them into darkness as German soldiers entered the church above. Jim lit a candle, revealing their sanctuary, an ancient crypt containing several stone sarcophagi. As Marie tended Pierre's wounds, he admitted, Dietrich knows about the American. Not Jim specifically, but he knows one is working with us. Hours passed in tense silence until footsteps crossed directly above the trapdoor. 3 precise knocks followed. Then a voice called down. I know you're down there, Captain Dietrich said. Your priest was quite informative, once properly motivated. Marie's face drained of color at the implication that Henri had broken under torture. I offer you a choice, Dietrich continued. Dietrich, surrender now and I guarantee you will be treated as prisoners of war, not spies or terrorists. Refuse and I will simply seal this crypt with you inside. You have until dawn to decide. After Dietrich departed, the group exchanged grim looks. Did he break Henri or is this a calculated guess? Jim wondered aloud. If Henri betrayed us, he must have had no choice, Marie said, anguish evident in her voice. Dietrich's offer is a lie, Pierre insisted. Once he has us, he'll extract everything we know, then hang us as terrorists. They searched the crypt but found no alternative exit. The trapdoor was their only way out. We could rush him when he returns, Etienne suggested. Dietrich won't come alone, Jim countered. He'll have soldiers with him. Marie's expression became resolute. There's another possibility. I surrender, claiming to be the sole leader of the resistance. The rest of you remain hidden. Absolutely not, Jim said immediately. Dietrich wants a victory to report to his superiors, Marie explained. If he believes he's captured the resistance leader, it might buy enough time for the rest of you to escape when the search lessens. Jim gripped her arm. We didn't risk everything to rescue Pierre just to sacrifice you. 1 life for 4, Marie said softly. It's a simple calculation. No, Jim's voice hardened. We find another way. He turned to examine the crypt more carefully, probing the ancient walls and floor. There's always another option. Near one of the sarcophagi, Jim noticed a slight difference in the stonework, a section of floor that seemed newer than the rest. Here, he called quietly. Help me with this. Together they shifted the heavy stones, revealing what appeared to be an ancient drainage channel. Narrow, filthy, but potentially large enough for a person to crawl through. Where does it lead? Etienne asked. Probably to the river, Pierre suggested. These old crypts often had drainage systems to prevent flooding. Jim tested the opening. It's tight, but passable. We go now before Dietrich returns, Marie hesitated. And Father Henri? We leave him to Dietrich's mercy? The question hung heavy in the air. If he betrayed us under torture, Dietrich already has him, Jim said gently. If not, revealing ourselves won't help him. The painful logic of war settled over them. Sometimes survival required impossible choices. I'll go first, Jim decided, lowering himself into the narrow passage. Follow one at a time. If I don't come back or signal within 15 minutes, try another way. The passage was claustrophobic, filled with centuries of debris and spiders. Jim crawled on his belly, feeling his way forward in the absolute darkness. After what seemed an eternity, he felt a change in the air, fresher, cooler, and the passage began to slope upward. Finally, he emerged into the pre-dawn darkness beside the small river that ran behind the church. The exit was hidden by overgrown shrubs, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Jim returned to guide the others. Pierre went next, then Etienne, and finally Marie, each emerging filthy but alive into the early morning air. The logging camp, Marie whispered, helping Pierre to his feet. We go there now before daylight fully reveals us. As they melted into the forest shadows, Jim glanced back at the church spire, thinking of Father Henri. Whether the priest had broken or not, his courage had given them this chance. Some debts could never be repaid. Dawn broke as they reached the abandoned logging camp. As they established their makeshift hideout, Jim knew that Dietrich's rage would be terrible once he discovered their escape. The Gestapo captain would double his efforts, turn the village inside out looking for them. The war had changed for all of them. What had begun as Jim's simple struggle to survive behind enemy lines had evolved into something more profound, a fight for people who had become family through the crucible of shared danger. Rest while you can, he told the others as they settled into the abandoned foreman's cabin. Dietrich won't give up easily. Tomorrow we start fighting back. Through the rifle's scope, Jim could see the clear area where Wagner's car would stop, the kill zone they had identified during planning. His finger rested lightly on the guard outside the trigger, his breathing controlled and even despite the tension coursing through him. Marie and Pierre were positioned closer to the target. Marie disguised as a local woman returning from market, Pierre as a street sweeper, both carrying concealed weapons in case anything went wrong with Jim's shot. Their role was primarily to confirm the target and signal Jim, then extract safely in the confusion following the assassination. Colette, despite Marie's objections, had insisted on serving as their early warning system. Positioned at a cafe, across from the winery, she would signal when Wagner's car approached. Jim had been impressed and disturbed by the girl's cool determination, another reminder of how war forced children to grow up too quickly. A flash of light from the cafe window caught Jim's attention. Colette's signal. Wagner was coming. Jim settled deeper into position, his focus narrowing to the task at hand. The scope revealed a black Mercedes approaching the winery entrance, flanked by motorcycle escorts. Jim controlled his breathing. In, hold, partial, exhale, hold. The car stopped precisely where they had anticipated. A German soldier rushed to open the rear door. Through the scope, Jim saw a tall officer emerge, his uniform adorned with the insignia of an SS colonel. Wagner. Time seemed to slow as Jim made final adjustments for distance and wind. 320 meters, slight breeze from the west. Target moving slowly toward the entrance. Jim's finger moved to the trigger, applying gentle, steady pressure. Wagner paused to speak to another officer, creating the perfect moment. Jim exhaled partially, held and squeezed. The rifle kicked against his shoulder as the shot cracked across the evening air. Through the scope, Jim saw Wagner stagger, then collapse. Direct hit. Chaos erupted below. German soldiers shouted, civilians scattered, and gunfire erupted as panicked guards fired at shadows. Jim quickly gathered his equipment, preparing for extraction along his predetermined route. Something caught his eye. Movement near the winery entrance that didn't fit the pattern of panicked response. He raised the scope once more for a final check. His blood froze. Pierre had been spotted. A German officer was pointing directly at him while soldiers closed in. Jim watched helplessly as Pierre drew his concealed pistol, managing to shoot 2 soldiers before being overwhelmed by the others. They dragged him, struggling, into the winery. Jim scanned frantically for Marie, relief washing over him when he spotted her slipping away through the chaos, her disguise intact. At least she had escaped. There was nothing more he could do from his position. Jim retreated across the rooftop and down through the abandoned building, his mind racing. Pierre had been captured. The mission had succeeded. Wagner was dead. But at what cost? As he moved through the darkening streets toward their rendezvous point, Jim heard German trucks roaring through the village, sirens wailing. The night would be long and dangerous, the Germans certain to conduct house-to-house searches for Wagner's killers. He reached the stone bridge where Marie had arranged to meet, finding her already waiting, her face ashen in the moonlight. "Pierre?" she asked immediately, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "Captured," Jim confirmed grimly. They took him inside the winery. Marie closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders sagging. When she opened them again, determination had replaced despair. "We need to move," she said. "The Germans will lock down the entire area." "Colette?" "I haven't seen her since her signal," Jim replied, worry gnawing at him. "She should have gone straight home as planned." "She knows alternative routes," Marie assured him, though concern lined her face. "We'll check the emergency meeting point." As they turned to leave, the sound of approaching vehicles froze them in place. German trucks were crossing the bridge, ahead cutting off their planned escape route. Jim pulled Marie into the shadows beneath the bridge as searchlights swept the area above them. "They're moving faster than expected," Marie whispered. "Dietrich must have prepared contingency plans, in case of an attack." Jim nodded grimly. "They have Pierre. How long before he breaks under interrogation?" "Pierre is strong," Marie replied, but doubt shadowed her voice. "But everyone has limits. We need to assume the worst, that all our safe houses and contacts may soon be compromised." Jim looked at her in the dim light, understanding the full implications. "We need to rescue him." "Yes," Marie agreed, her voice hardening with resolve. "Or kill him before he can reveal everything." The ruthless calculation in her voice didn't shock Jim anymore. This was the reality of their war. Sometimes mercy meant a bullet, rather than torture and betrayal. "We'll rescue him," Jim said firmly. "I didn't come this far to start executing our own people." Marie studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "First, we need to reach the others, warn them. Then we plan." She looked up at the soldiers, still searching the bridge above. "And we pray that Pierre's strength holds longer than Dietrich's patience." As they slipped away into the darkness, Jim felt the weight of their mission pressing down on him. This was no longer about assassinating a Nazi officer or sabotaging supply lines. Now they fought not just for France's freedom, but for Pierre's life and the survival of everything they had built. The line between duty and loyalty, already blurred, had disappeared entirely. There was only the next step, the next fight, and the growing certainty that whatever happened, there would be no turning back. 3 days passed at the abandoned logging camp, each hour marked by the distant sounds of German vehicles patrolling the forest roads. From their vantage point atop a small ridge, Jim watched through stolen binoculars as smoke rose from the village in the valley below. Not the billowing black clouds of buildings burning, but rather the persistent gray haze of a community under occupation. More soldiers, more vehicles, more fear. "They've doubled the patrols since yesterday," he reported, lowering the binoculars as Marie approached. "Checkpoints on every road. They're searching vehicles, checking papers." Marie's face remained impassive, though the dark circles beneath her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. Etienne returned from his scouting mission an hour ago. "The news isn't good." "Tell me," Jim said, following her back toward the foreman's cabin that had become their temporary headquarters. "Dietrich has arrested 27 villagers, anyone suspected of resistance sympathies. They're being held in the town hall." Marie's voice grew tight. Father Henri among them. Jim had expected as much after their escape from the church crypt, but the confirmation still hit him like a physical blow. "Any word on how they're being treated?" "Harshly," Marie replied, pushing open the cabin door. Public beatings. No food. Interrogations day and night. Inside, Pierre sat at a rough wooden table, his face still bruised but healing. Beside him, Colette pored over a hand-drawn map, her young face tight with concentration. Etienne and Lucille stood near the small fireplace, speaking in hushed tones while Michel kept watch at the rear window. "Jim," Pierre acknowledged with a nod. "Marie tells you about Father Henri?" "Just now," Jim replied, taking a seat across from him. "Any contact from our other cells? Anyone who might help?" Pierre shook his head. "Communications are cut. Dietrich has men watching every drop point, every messenger route. We're isolated." Jim absorbed this grim assessment, considering their dwindling options. The resistance network Marie had carefully built over 2 years was now in tatters, its members scattered or captured, its support system crumbling under Dietrich's methodical assault. "The weapons cache at the old Dubois barn is still secure," Lucille offered. "At least 12 rifles, some explosives. Enough for a direct action if we choose that path." The unspoken question hung in the air. What action could they possibly take? With only 6 active fighters, one still recovering from torture, against what had to be at least 50 German soldiers now stationed in the village, conventional tactics seemed suicidal. "We need to face facts," Pierre said, his voice soft but firm. "Our position is untenable. The best strategy now is to withdraw, move deeper into unoccupied territory, regroup, reconnect with Allied forces. And abandon everyone Dietrich has captured," Colette demanded, looking up from her map. "Abandon Father Henri, who risked everything to help us? Abandon our home? Sometimes strategic withdrawal is the only path to eventual victory," Jim said gently, understanding both perspectives. Military logic favored Pierre's position, but his heart aligned with Colette's outrage. "There's more," Marie said, her expression grim. "Etienne, tell them what you heard in the village." The burly blacksmith cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Dietrich has issued an ultimatum. If the resistance fighters don't surrender within 3 days, he will execute 5 hostages each day until they do." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Jim studied the faces around him, each showing different shades of the same bleak calculation. Surrender meant torture and death, yet resistance now carried a terrible price for innocent villagers. "We cannot surrender," Pierre said finally. "Even if we wanted to, Dietrich would execute us all anyway. Our deaths would serve no purpose except to demoralize the entire region. But we must do something," Colette insisted. "We can't just let them die." Jim turned to Marie, whose opinion would ultimately carry the most weight. "What do you think?" Marie was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant. "Dietrich is creating an impossible choice by design," she finally said. "He knows what surrendering would mean for us, and he knows what refusing will mean for the hostages. He's using our humanity against us. So we outsmart him," Jim suggested. "Find a third option." "Such as?" Pierre asked skeptically. Before Jim could respond, the cabin door burst open. Michel, who had been watching the forest path, rushed in. "Someone's coming," he hissed. "Single figure on foot." Instantly, weapons appeared in everyone's hands. Jim moved to the window, peering cautiously through the grimy glass. A solitary figure staggered up the overgrown logging road, a woman middle-aged, her clothes torn and dirty. "It's Madame Laurent," Lucille identified her. "The seamstress from the square." "She could be followed," Pierre warned, his expression hardening with suspicion. "Or she could need our help," Marie countered, already moving toward the door. Jim caught her arm. "Let me check first. Cover me from here." Marie nodded reluctantly. Jim slipped outside, pistol in hand, approaching the woman with cautious speed. She looked up at his appearance, relief flooding her exhausted face. "American," she gasped. "Thank God. Marie, is she?" "She's safe," Jim assured her, quickly checking the forest behind her for signs of pursuit. Seeing none, he supported her trembling form. "Come inside, you look ready to collapse." The woman barely made it to the cabin before her legs gave out. Colette rushed to bring her water while Marie helped her to a chair. The woman, Madame Laurent, gulped the water gratefully, her hands shaking. Dietrich's men came for me yesterday, she explained once she'd caught her breath. I was on their list. Someone told them I had mended resistance uniforms. I managed to slip away through my cellar while they were breaking down the front door. How did you find us? Pierre asked, suspicion still evident in his voice. Father, Henri told me about this place before he was taken. She looked down, guilt crossing her features. He said if anything happened to him, I should seek you here. Jim and Marie exchanged concerned glances. If Henri had revealed this location to Madame Laurent, who else might he have told? Or worse, had he revealed it under torture? What's happening? In the village? Marie asked, settling beside the seamstress. It's terrible, Madame Laurent whispered. Soldiers everywhere. Searches day and night. The hostages are kept in the town hall, but they bring them out each morning for public questioning. She stumbled over the word, unwilling to directly name the brutality she'd witnessed. Father Henri is the worst. Dietrich seems to have a particular hatred for him. Has Henri broken? Pierre asked bluntly. Has he given them names? Madame Laurent looked shocked at the suggestion. Never. He says nothing no matter what they do. To him, he just prays. It drives Dietrich mad with frustration. A measure of relief passed through the group, though Jim noted it was tempered by the knowledge of what such resistance must cost the priest. There's something else you should know, Madame Laurent continued, her voice lowering further. There's a traitor, someone who's been feeding information to the Germans for months. I overheard Dietrich speaking to his aide. They mentioned a regular informant, someone close to the resistance. The atmosphere in the cabin instantly changed, tension crackling like electricity before a storm. Eyes darted between members, each mentally calculating who might have betrayed them. Did you hear a name? Marie asked, her voice carefully controlled. Madame Laurent shook her head. No, only that their information has been reliable and that they are highly placed. It explains much, Pierre said bitterly. The convoy ambush that nearly failed. How quickly they found my hiding place after Wagner's assassination. Jim's mind raced, reviewing every operation, every setback, searching for the pattern that might reveal the traitor. Whoever it is must have limited information, he reasoned. Otherwise, Dietrich would have captured all of us by now. Unless he's playing a longer game, Marie suggested grimly, using this informant to unravel our entire network, not just our local cell. The possibility hung in the air like poison gas. Jim watched as each fighter mentally reviewed their interactions, questioning loyalties that had seemed unshakable just moments before. This changes nothing about our immediate situation, Jim finally said, trying to refocus the group. We still have hostages to save and Dietrich to deal with. The traitor is a problem for later. Marie nodded, visibly gathering her resolve. Jim's right. We need a plan now, 3 days before the executions begin. I have information that might help, Madame Laurent offered. Dietrich himself inspects the hostages each evening at 8 o'clock. It's the only time he regularly appears outside the German headquarters. Jim's eyes met Marie's, the same thought clearly forming between them. You're thinking of assassinating Dietrich, Pierre stated, reading their expressions. Cut off the snake's head. It worked with Wagner, Jim pointed out. Wagner wasn't expecting it, Pierre countered. Dietrich is. He'll be prepared, protected. Maybe, Jim acknowledged, but it's our best chance to throw the German command into disarray. In the confusion, we might be able to free the hostages. The discussion continued into the evening, strategies, proposed and discarded. Risks weighed against desperate necessity. As darkness fell, a plan began to emerge. Dangerous with slim chances of success, but better than surrender or inaction. Jim would take position on the clock tower opposite the town hall, providing sniper coverage. Marie, Etienne, and Lucille would approach from 3 different directions, creating coordinated diversions to draw away guards. Michel would disable the German communications center with explosives. Pierre, still too injured for direct combat, would secure an escape route. If everything went perfectly, They would eliminate Dietrich, free the hostages, and disappear back into the forest before German reinforcements could respond effectively. If anything went wrong, Jim pushed the thought aside. In war, sometimes, the only choices were bad ones. We move tomorrow night, Marie decided. Just before Dietrich's inspection at 8. That gives us a day to prepare, to gather what intelligence we can. As the others began checking weapons and discussing specific assignments, Jim pulled Marie aside. There's still the matter of the traitor, he said quietly. We need to consider the possibility that our plan might be compromised before we even begin. Marie's expression darkened. I've been thinking about that. There are only 2 people outside this cabin who knew about our planned ambush of Wagner. Father Henri and... She hesitated, pain crossing her features. And? Jim prompted gently. And Jean Mercier, the baker. He provided information about Wagner's movements, helped time the assassination. Marie looked away. He has a son with tuberculosis, expensive treatments. He's always been committed to the cause, but desperation makes people do things they never thought possible. Jim finished for her. Do you think it's him? I don't want to, Marie admitted, but we need to consider every possibility. Jim nodded grimly. Tomorrow we'll send Colette to do reconnaissance, see if Mercier has been arrested along with the others. If he's still free while known sympathizers are being rounded up, then we'll have our answer, Marie concluded. Her eyes met Jim's, haunted by the weight of suspicion. I hate this, doubting people I've trusted for years. It's what Dietrich wants, Jim reminded her. To turn us against each other, to make us see enemies in every shadow. And knowing that doesn't make it any less effective, Marie said softly. The next morning, Colette departed for the village disguised as a farm girl seeking news of her fictional brother. Despite Marie's reluctance to risk her sister, Colette was their best option. Young enough to appear innocent, yet skilled enough to observe crucial details without arousing suspicion. While they waited, final preparations continued. Jim cleaned, his rifle methodically, checking and rechecking the action. Each fighter would carry only essential weapons. Stealth and speed would matter more than firepower. Midday passed with no sign of Colette. As afternoon stretched toward evening, tension mounted in the cabin. Pierre voiced what they all feared. She should have been back by now. Just as they were beginning to consider the worst, the cabin door opened and Colette slipped inside. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling slightly. What happened? Marie demanded, rushing to her sister. Are you hurt? Colette shook her head. I'm not hurt, but... She swallowed hard. It's worse than we thought. Dietrich has moved up his timetable. The first executions are scheduled for tomorrow at noon, not 3 days from now. How many? Jim asked, his voice tight. 5, Colette replied. Father Henri among them. They've built a gallows in the town square. The news landed, like a physical blow. Their carefully constructed plan, already desperate, now seemed impossible. There's more, Colette continued. I saw Jean Mercier, the baker. He wasn't arrested. He was bringing bread to the German headquarters. The soldiers treated him with familiarity, not like the other villagers. Marie closed her eyes briefly. Pain etched across her features. Then we have our traitor. I'm sorry, Colette whispered. Did you see Dietrich? Jim asked, focusing on their immediate objective. Colette nodded. He inspected the town hall as Madame Laurent said, but he had at least 10 soldiers with him. He's being very careful. Then we adapt, Jim said. Move our timetable forward. We hit them tonight, not tomorrow. With what changes? Pierre challenged. We've barely finalized the original plan. Now you want to improvise an attack on even more heavily guarded targets, with fewer hours to prepare? We don't have a choice, Jim replied simply. It's tonight. Or never. Perhaps it should be never, Pierre said quietly. Perhaps we should recognize when a battle cannot be won. So we abandon Henri? The other hostages? Marie asked, her voice sharp. Leave them to die while we save ourselves? Pierre met her gaze steadily. Sometimes, yes, That's exactly what resistance means, continuing the fight even when individuals must be sacrificed. You know this, Marie. You've always known it. A tense silence fell over the cabin. Jim watched Marie, seeing the terrible calculation in her eyes, the leader weighing the lives of a few against the survival of the cause. We go tonight, she finally decided. But with changes. This isn't about killing Dietrich anymore. It's about saving as many hostages as possible, then disappearing. Jim nodded, relief mixing with apprehension. We'll need to create multiple diversions, something big enough to draw most of the Germans away from the town hall. The fuel depot at the eastern edge of the village, Etienne suggested. If we blow that, every soldier will respond. And we risk burning down half the village, Marie countered. No, we need something precise, controlled. The planning continued with renewed urgency, the original assassination scheme transforming into a rescue operation. By dusk, they had cobbled together a strategy that, while still desperately risky, offered at least a slim chance of success. Michel and Lucille would create diversions at opposite ends of the village. Jim would still take the clock tower position, but now to provide covering fire for the rescue rather than to assassinate Dietrich. Marie and Etienne would enter the town hall directly, free the hostages and lead them to Pierre's extraction route. As they gathered their weapons and prepared to move out, Jim pulled Marie aside one last time. If this goes wrong, he said quietly. If we get separated, we won't, Marie interrupted firmly. If we do, Jim insisted, meet at the old hunting cabin near the lake. 3 days. If you're not there by then. Marie nodded, understanding the unspoken conclusion. In war, contingencies weren't pessimism, they were necessity. Jim, she said softly, her composure slipping for just a moment. Watch over Colette if I don't. That won't happen, Jim cut her off, just as she had done to him. We all come back. Together. The ghost of a smile touched Marie's lips at having her own determination reflected back at her. She reached out, her fingers briefly squeezing his. No other words were necessary. Night shrouded the village in shadow as the resistance fighters moved into position. Jim climbed the narrow spiral staircase of the church clock tower, rifle slung, across his back. From this vantage point, he would have clear sightlines to both the town hall entrance and the surrounding streets. Perfect for covering the others' approach and retreat. The village square below lay eerily quiet, illuminated by occasional German searchlights sweeping across cobblestones. The gallows stood like a dark promise in the center, ready for tomorrow's grim work. Jim forced the image from his mind, focusing instead on the town hall steps where 2 German soldiers stood guard. Through his rifle scope, he scanned the area methodically, counting guards, noting patrol patterns. More soldiers than they'd anticipated. Dietrich had indeed strengthened security. Jim's finger tapped a silent message against his rifle stock. 343. 3 guards at the front, 4 visible through windows inside, 3 more patrolling the perimeter. In the distance, a flash of light followed by a dull thump signaled Michel's diversion, a small explosion at the German motor pool. Moments later, from the opposite side of the village came Lucille's contribution, a series of rifle shots and the sound of breaking glass. Jim watched as the German response unfolded below. Several soldiers ran toward the motor pool explosion, while others moved toward Lucille's diversion. But not all. Dietrich had trained them well. 4 guards remained at the town hall, more alert now, weapons ready. Through his scope, Jim saw Marie and Etienne approach from different directions, using shadows and alleyways for cover. They were 30 meters from the entrance when disaster struck. A German truck suddenly rounded the corner, its headlights sweeping across the square, directly illuminating Marie. Shouts of alarm erupted as soldiers spotted her. Jim responded instantly, firing 2 precise shots that dropped the closest guards. Etienne broke from cover, sprinting toward the entrance, firing his own weapon. The element of surprise lost. The night erupted into chaos. Jim maintained his position, providing covering fire as Marie and Etienne fought their way inside the town. More German soldiers poured into the square, drawn by the gunfire. Jim picked his targets carefully, making each shot count, but there were too many. A spotlight suddenly blazed from a German vehicle, illuminating the clock tower. Jim threw himself aside as bullets splintered wood where he'd been kneeling seconds before. Rolling to a new position, he continued firing, buying precious time for Marie and Etienne. Minutes stretched like hours as Jim maintained his desperate defense. Finally, movement at the town hall entrance caught his eye, Marie emerging with a group of ragged villagers, Father Henri among them. Etienne covered their retreat, firing at pursuing Germans. Jim redirected his fire to clear their escape route. One by one, the freed hostages disappeared down a side street toward Pierre's extraction point. Marie and Etienne were the last, running backward, still exchanging fire with German soldiers. They were going to make it. Against all odds, the rescue was succeeding. Then the unthinkable happened. As Marie reached the corner, a figure stepped from the shadows. Jean Mercier, the baker. The traitor. In his hand gleamed a pistol, aimed directly at Marie. Jim swung his rifle toward this new threat, but before he could fire, Father Henri lunged forward, placing himself between Marie and the weapon. The pistol fired once, the sound sharp in the night air. Henri staggered but remained standing, his arms spread wide, protecting Marie even as his cassock darkened with blood. Etienne's return fire dropped Mercier where he stood. Marie grabbed Henri, dragging him toward safety as Jim provided covering fire from above. They vanished into the alleyway, the last of the hostages to escape. Jim began his own retreat, descending the tower stairs as German fire intensified around the church. He had nearly reached the bottom when a massive explosion shook the building, far larger than their planned diversions. Through the church's stained glass windows, he saw an orange glow rising from the eastern edge of the village. The fuel depot. Someone had ignited it after all. Gunfire and shouting filled the night as Jim slipped from the church through a rear door. The village was now in chaos, Germans rushing to contain the spreading fire, civilians emerging from homes, the freed, hostages disappearing into the darkness. Jim ran through back gardens and narrow passages, heading for their predetermined rendezvous point outside the village. Twice he encountered German patrols, forced to find alternate routes. By the time he reached the old stone bridge marking the rendezvous, his lungs burned and fresh blood seeped from a graze on his arm where a bullet had found him. Pierre waited in the shadows beneath the bridge, along with several of the freed hostages. Lucille had also made it back, though she nursed a bullet wound in her shoulder. "Michel?" Jim asked between gasping breaths. Pierre shook his head grimly. Caught in the explosion at the motor pool. He didn't make it. "Marie? Etienne?" "Not yet," Lucille replied, "but we heard shooting from the eastern quarter. They might have been forced to take another route." Jim checked his watch. They could wait only 10 more minutes before German patrols would make this position untenable. Every second stretched, with agonizing slowness as he stared into the darkness, willing Marie to appear. 8 minutes passed. 9. Just as Jim was preparing to order the group to move out, shadows detached from the tree line. Etienne appeared, supporting Father Henri between himself and Marie. The priest's cassock was soaked with blood, his face ashen in the moonlight. "Get him down here," Jim ordered, rushing to help them down the slippery embankment. They laid Henri gently on the ground beneath the bridge, where Pierre immediately began examining his wound. "How bad?" Jim asked quietly. Pierre's expression said everything. "The bullet punctured his lung. He's bleeding internally. Without a hospital." He left the sentence unfinished. Henri's eyes fluttered open, finding Marie's face hovering above him. "The others?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Safe," Marie assured him, gripping his hand. "You saved us, all of us." A faint smile touched the priest's lips. "Not all," he murmured. "Mercier. I tried to reach him too. To help him. Understand, forgiveness. Save your strength," Jim urged, though he knew it was futile advice. Henri's gaze shifted to Jim. "American," he said softly. "You found your purpose here, yes?" Beyond duty? Jim nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Good. Henri's breathing grew more labored. The greatest victory is to fight for what you love, not what you're ordered to. A distant explosion rocked the night, secondary fires reaching more fuel at the depot. The orange glow above the village intensified. We need to move, Pierre warned. Germans will be everywhere soon. Marie looked down at Henri, anguish plain on her face. Father, go, Henri whispered. I'm not finished here yet. Still work to do. We can't just leave you, Marie protested. Henri's blood-stained hand squeezed hers with surprising strength. You must. My journey ends here. Yours continues. His gaze swept over all of them. Carry on. Remember, resistance isn't just about fighting. It's about preserving what makes us human, even in darkness. Another explosion closer now. German voices called in the distance. We have to go, Jim said gently to Marie. Now, with tears streaming down her face, Marie bent to press a kiss to Henri's forehead. Go with God, Father. I go to meet him, Henri replied serenely. You go to continue his work. They left him there beneath the bridge, his Bible clutched to his chest. None looked back as they slipped into the forest, the freed hostages following in a ragged line. Behind them the village burned, a beacon of Dietrich's fury, but also a symbol of their defiance. They had won a victory tonight, but at terrible cost. Michel dead, Henri dying, their village in flames. The war had never felt more personal, nor more brutal. As they reached the safety of deeper forest, Jim found Marie walking alone, slightly separated from the others. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, but her eyes burned with a cold determination. He recognized all too well. We'll regroup at the logging camp, she said when he fell into step beside her. Then move north toward the Allied lines. Take the hostages to safety. Jim nodded. And then? Marie glanced back at the orange glow on the horizon, her home burning. And then we return. Dietrich thinks he's won, that he's broken us, he's wrong. This isn't over, Jim agreed, understanding the resolve in her voice. No, Marie said softly, her expression hardening as she turned away from the burning village. For Dietrich, it's just beginning. 2 weeks after the burning of the village, Jim crouched behind a fallen oak on the ridgeline overlooking the winding mountain road. The late autumn air carried a biting chill that seemed to seep into his bones as he waited, motionless, rifle resting on a steady branch. Below, the road curved sharply between steep embankments, a natural bottleneck that would force any vehicle to slow almost to a crawl. The perfect kill zone. 3 days of surveillance had confirmed their intelligence. Captain Dietrich would be traveling this road today, heading to regional headquarters with his reports on the resistance cleansing operation. His convoy would be heavily armed. 2 vehicles in front, Dietrich's staff car in the middle, 2 more vehicles behind. But the terrain gave the resistance the advantage of high ground and surprise. And after the events of the past 2 weeks, surprise was their only remaining asset. Jim adjusted his position slightly, easing the cramp in his leg. The wound in his side had fully healed, leaving only a puckered scar and an occasional twinge to remind him of his fall from the sky nearly 2 months ago. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then. The American paratrooper who had landed in Marie's garden had died a little each day, replaced by someone harder, more desperate, more committed to this foreign soil than he'd ever been to his military objectives. Marie appeared silently beside him, moving with the woodland stealth she'd perfected over years of resistance operations. Her face was leaner now, all softness stripped away by recent losses and hardships. Only 16 of the original resistance fighters remained, scattered across 3 positions on the ridgeline. Lucille's in position with the explosives, she reported quietly. Pierre has the rear ambush ready. All we need now is for Dietrich to arrive. Jim nodded, checking his watch. If their schedule holds, they should be here within the hour. Marie settled beside him. her shoulder touching his as she surveyed the terrain below. The casual contact might have seemed trivial to an observer, but Jim recognized it for what it was, the silent acknowledgement of a bond forged in blood and sacrifice. "After today," she said softly, "we should move the group south. The Allied front is pushing forward. Within weeks they might reach this region. If we survive today," Jim amended. A ghost of a smile touched Marie's lips. Always the optimist. Despite himself, Jim chuckled. Occupational hazard for Americans. The brief moment of lightness faded as Marie's expression grew serious again. "I've been thinking about what happens after, when this area is liberated. Will you rejoin your unit?" The question hung in the air between them. Jim had asked himself the same thing countless times over the past weeks. His military duty seemed distant now, abstract compared to the immediate reality of the resistance and the people who had become his family. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me feels I should finish what I started. But another part feels that this is where you belong now," Marie finished for him. Jim nodded. "Something like that. Whatever you decide," Marie said, her voice careful, measured, "know that you will always have a place here. With us." The unspoken addition, "with me," hung in the air, neither acknowledged nor denied. Before Jim could respond, a distant rumble interrupted their conversation, engines approaching from the south. Marie tensed, reaching for her binoculars. 5 vehicles, she confirmed after a moment. Matches Dietrich's usual convoy pattern. Jim shouldered his rifle, peering through the scope for verification. Lead vehicle just came into view. German. Military. 4 soldiers visible. Marie touched the radio transmitter at her belt, a precious piece of equipment salvaged from a downed Allied plane. "All positions, stand ready. Convoy approaching from the south. Hold fire until my signal." Throughout the hillside, resistance fighters checked weapons and steeled themselves for what was to come. They had rehearsed this plan for days. Lucille would detonate explosives to disable the lead vehicles, creating a roadblock. Simultaneously, Pierre's team would attack from the rear, preventing escape. Jim's snipers would eliminate any Germans who survived the initial assault. With the convoy trapped, Marie would lead a team to confirm Dietrich's death and salvage any intelligence or supplies. The sound of engines grew louder. Through his scope, Jim could now see the lead vehicle clearly, a standard German transport, truck with a mounted machine gun. Behind it, a smaller Kubelwagen carrying 4 soldiers, then Dietrich's black Mercedes staff car, followed by 2 more military vehicles. "Range 700 meters and closing," Jim murmured. "Lucille should trigger the explosives when they reach the red marker stone." Marie nodded, her body coiled with tension. "Everyone stays focused on their assignments. No heroics. We hit hard and disappear before reinforcements can arrive." The convoy approached the narrow passage. Jim counted down the distance silently. 600 meters. 500. 400. Something flickered at the edge of Jim's awareness. A sensation, more than a sound. He shifted his scope slightly, scanning the tree line opposite their position. There, a glint of metal among the branches. And another. "Marie," he whispered urgently. "The far ridgeline. We've got company." Marie raised her binoculars, focusing, where Jim indicated. Her sharp intake of breath confirmed his fears. "German patrol, at least a dozen men." "They must have anticipated the ambush," Jim said, mind racing through implications. "How? We've been so careful." "Question for later," Marie replied, already reaching for her radio. "We need to abort. Now." Too late. Below, the lead vehicle had reached the trigger point. The hillside erupted as Lucille's explosives detonated, sending the truck cartwheeling into the air in a ball of flame. Simultaneously, Pierre's team emerged from cover at the rear of the convoy, opening fire on the last vehicles. The ambush was sprung, but now the Germans on the opposite ridge opened fire on the resistance positions. It was a trap within a trap. "Fall. Back," Marie shouted into the radio. All positions, fall back, we've been compromised. Bullets tore through the foliage around them as German fire intensified from across the ravine. Jim returned fire, providing cover as Marie organized their retreat. The carefully planned ambush had deteriorated into chaos within seconds. Below, the convoy was in disarray. The lead vehicle burned, blocking the road. The rear vehicles were engaged with Pierre's team, but the middle, Dietrich's staff car, had pulled off the road into a small clearing, protected by soldiers forming a defensive perimeter. Jim swung his scope back to the car just as the rear door opened. Dietrich emerged, cool and composed amid the chaos. He spoke to his aide, who ran to a radio set in one of the undamaged vehicles. "He's calling for reinforcements," Jim warned. "We need to move." Marie nodded grimly, but as she turned to retreat, her expression suddenly froze in horror. Following her gaze, Jim saw what had caused her reaction. Across the road, being led from one of the German vehicles by two soldiers, was Colette. The girl's hands were bound before her, her face bruised, but defiant as Dietrich approached her. Even from this distance, Jim could read the captain's body language, smug satisfaction. "Colette," Marie whispered, her voice cracking. "How did they—" "Bait," Jim realized aloud. "They knew we were planning something and used her to draw us out." Marie's hand tightened on her weapon, knuckles white. "I have to get to her." "Marie, wait," Jim began, but she was already moving, sliding down the steep embankment toward the road below. Cursing under his breath, Jim provided covering fire, targeting the Germans on the opposite ridge to keep their attention away from Marie's descent. "Pierre," he called over the radio. "Marie's going for Colette. Dietrich has her. We need suppressing fire on the ridge positions." "Understood," came Pierre's terse reply. Moments later, concentrated fire from Pierre's position forced the Germans on the ridge to seek cover, temporarily relieving the pressure on Jim's location. Jim continued firing methodically, watching as Marie reached the bottom of the embankment and took cover behind a boulder near the burning lead vehicle. She was 30 meters from Dietrich's position and Colette. Through his scope, Jim could now see Dietrich's face clearly. The Gestapo captain wore a look of supreme confidence as he surveyed the hillsides, seemingly unconcerned by the gunfire erupting around him. He turned to one of his men and gave an order, gesturing toward the ridgeline where most of the resistance fighters were positioned. Jim's blood ran cold as he realized what was about to happen. "Marie," he shouted into the radio. "He's calling. In mortars, get out of there!" Whether she heard him or not, Marie remained in position, clearly calculating her next move to reach Colette. Jim made his decision in an instant. Slinging his rifle over his shoulder, he began moving laterally along the ridge, seeking a path down to the road that would put him behind Dietrich's position. The first mortar shells struck the hillside seconds later, sending earth and splintered trees skyward. The German gunners on the opposite ridge intensified their fire, keeping the resistance fighters pinned down as more mortars rained down. Jim half ran, half slid down a steep game trail, using trees to control his descent. Gunfire and explosions echoed through the ravine as he reached the bottom, crouching behind a fallen tree to assess the situation. From this new angle, he could see that Dietrich had moved Colette to the staff car, apparently preparing to retreat with his valuable hostage. Marie remained pinned behind her boulder, unable to advance under heavy German fire. Jim drew his pistol and moved forward, using the burning lead vehicle for cover. A German soldier appeared suddenly around the wreckage. Jim fired twice, dropping him before he could sound an alarm. He pulled the dead soldier's MP-40 submachine gun from his limp hands and continued his approach. Over the radio, Pierre's voice crackled with urgency. "We're taking heavy casualties. Can't hold this position much longer." "Fall back," Jim ordered. "Get everyone out. Marie and I will handle Dietrich and extract Colette." "That's suicide," Pierre protested. "Just go," Jim insisted. "That's an order." Without waiting for a response, Jim switched channels. "Marie, I'm approaching from the east side of the road. When I engage, make your move for Colette." Marie's reply was immediate. "Understood." Jim took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then he stepped out from behind the burning truck, MP-40 blazing as he charged Dietrich's position. The Germans, caught by surprise from this unexpected direction, scrambled. for cover. Two fell immediately under Jim's fire, while the others returned fire wildly. As planned, Marie seized the opportunity. She broke from her cover, sprinting toward the staff car where Colette was being held. A German soldier moved to intercept her, but Marie's pistol dropped him with a single shot to the head. Jim continued his assault, working his way closer to Dietrich, who had taken cover behind his Mercedes. The Gestapo captain fired his Luger methodically, his face a mask of cold fury as his carefully laid trap disintegrated. In the chaos, Marie reached the staff car, dispatching the soldier guarding Colette with brutal efficiency. Jim caught a glimpse of her untying her sister before focusing again on Dietrich. The German officer, perhaps realizing his hostage advantage was lost, suddenly abandoned his position behind the car. He fired twice at Jim, forcing him to duck, then ran toward a small footpath leading into the forest. "He's making a break for it," Jim shouted over the radio. "Marie, get Colette clear. I'm going after Dietrich." Without waiting for her response, Jim pursued, ignoring the bullets that whined past him from the remaining German soldiers. Dietrich disappeared into the trees, but Jim followed, driven by the certainty that if the Gestapo captain escaped, he would return with overwhelming force. The forest closed around him, dampening the sounds of battle behind. Jim moved carefully, now tracking Dietrich through the underbrush, a snapped twig here, a boot print in soft earth there. His years of hunting in Ohio's forests served him well as he closed the distance. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark inches from Jim's head. He dove for cover behind a massive oak as two more shots followed in quick succession. "I know you're there, American," Dietrich's voice called in accented English. "Your accent was reported to me after the Wagner assassination. The mysterious American paratrooper fighting for a country not his own." Jim remained silent, using the sound of Dietrich's voice to pinpoint his location, approximately 20 meters ahead, behind a fallen tree. "What is it you hope to accomplish?" Dietrich continued. "The Reich will crush this pathetic resistance. Your death will mean nothing." Jim moved silently to his right, circling toward Dietrich's position. The German officer kept talking, giving away his location with each word. "Perhaps you think yourself a hero, a noble warrior fighting for freedom." Contempt dripped from Dietrich's voice. "There are no heroes in war, American, only survivors and corpses." Jim had nearly flanked Dietrich's position now. He could see the German officer crouched behind the fallen tree, pistol trained on Jim's previous location, unaware that his quarry had moved. "You're right about one thing," Jim called, causing Dietrich to whirl around in surprise. "There are only survivors and corpses in war." Jim fired the MP-40, but it jammed after the first shot, which went wide. Dietrich recovered quickly, firing his Luger twice. Jim felt a searing pain as one bullet grazed his left arm, but he was already charging forward, discarding the useless submachine gun and drawing his combat knife. Dietrich fired again, but in his haste, the shot missed. Before he could squeeze the trigger once more, Jim crashed into him, driving him backward over the fallen tree. The Luger went flying as both men tumbled to the forest floor. What followed was a desperate primal struggle. Dietrich was surprisingly strong, his lean frame disguising wiry muscles hardened by years of service. He struck Jim a vicious blow to the wounded arm, sending waves of pain radiating up to his shoulder. Jim countered with a knee to Dietrich's midsection, briefly knocking the wind from him. The German recovered quickly, however, producing a hidden knife from his boot. He slashed wildly, opening a gash across Jim's chest before Jim could catch his wrist. They grappled in the dirt and leaves, each seeking advantage, each knowing that to lose meant death. Jim smashed his forehead into Dietrich's nose, feeling it crunch beneath the impact. Blood poured down the German's face, but his grip on the knife didn't loosen. Dietrich rolled, momentarily gaining the upper hand as he straddled Jim, knife poised for a killing thrust. Jim caught his wrist with both hands, straining against the German's descending strength. The knife trembled between them, inches from Jim's throat. "Die knowing you failed," Dietrich snarled through bloodied teeth. "Your resistance friends will join you soon enough." The knife edged closer, its tip pricking Jim's skin. With a desperate surge of strength born of pure survival instinct, Jim twisted violently, leveraging his hips to throw Dietrich off balance. They rolled again, the knife still between them, its lethal point now wavering between their bodies. In that moment of uncertain balance, Jim made his choice. He released his grip on Dietrich's wrist with one hand and instead grabbed the knife, blade directly, feeling it slice into his palm. The pain was immediate, intense, but it allowed him to control the direction of the blade. With a roar of effort and agony, Jim redirected the knife's momentum and drove it into Dietrich's chest. The German's eyes widened in shock. His mouth opened, but only a choking gasp emerged. Jim pushed the knife deeper, feeling resistance as it penetrated the heart. Dietrich's body convulsed once, then went still, his eyes fixed and empty. Jim rolled away, gasping for breath, his hand bleeding profusely where the knife had sliced through his palm. The forest was eerily silent now, the distant sounds of battle having faded. He struggled to his feet, retrieving his pistol from where it had fallen during the fight. He was preparing to head back to the road when Marie's voice called his name. She appeared through the trees moments later, Colette close behind her. Both women were disheveled, dirt-smudged, but alive. "Dietrich?" Marie asked, taking in the scene with a single glance. Jim nodded toward the German's body. Won't be troubling anyone anymore. Relief washed over Marie's face. She moved to Jim, examining his bleeding hand and the gash across his chest. "You need medical attention." "Later," Jim said, glancing at Colette. The girl's face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut, but her expression remained defiant. "Are you all right?" he asked her. "I didn't tell them anything," Colette replied, her chin lifting slightly. "They tried, but I didn't break." Pride and sorrow mingled in Jim's heart. She was so young to have endured such things, yet she stood straight, undefeated. "We need to move," Marie said. "The remaining Germans will have called for reinforcements." Jim nodded, but as he took a step, a wave of dizziness washed over him. He looked down, noticing for the first time that his shirt was soaked with blood, not just from his hand and the chest wound, but from a bullet hole in his side that he hadn't even felt in the adrenaline of combat. "Jim?" Marie's voice seemed to come from far away as his knees buckled. She caught him, lowering him gently to the ground. "Jim, stay with me." He tried to focus on her face, but his vision was blurring. "You need to go," he managed to say. "Germans? Coming. We're not leaving you," Marie insisted, pressing her hand against the wound in his side to slow the bleeding. Jim gripped her wrist with his uninjured hand. "Listen to me. You have to take Colette and go, now, while you still can." "I can walk," Jim protested, trying to rise, only to fall back as pain lanced through him. "Jim," Marie said softly, her eyes meeting his. "Please." Distant engine sounds reached them, German vehicles approaching. Jim made his decision. "Get to the logging camp," he instructed. "Pierre should be regrouping there with the others. From there, head south toward Allied lines." "And you?" Colette asked, her young voice trembling slightly. Jim forced a smile. "I'll find another way out, but you need to go now." Marie wasn't fooled. She knew what he was proposing, to stay behind, to buy them time. Her eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. "I'll come back for you," she promised. "I know," Jim lied, squeezing her hand one last time. "Now go." With aching reluctance, Marie rose, helping Jim prop himself against a tree. She handed him her spare pistol and the remaining ammunition. "Au revoir, American," she whispered, pressing a swift kiss to his forehead. "Au revoir, Marie," he replied softly. He watched as she led Colette away, the two figures disappearing quickly among the trees. Only when they were gone did he allow himself to acknowledge the full extent of his injuries. The bullet in his side had likely punctured something vital. Even if he survived the coming confrontation, he wouldn't last long afterward. But that didn't matter now. All that mattered was giving Marie and Colette enough time to escape. Jim checked the pistols, positioning them within easy reach. With effort, he dragged Dietrich's body closer, taking the German's Luger and extra ammunition as well. Then he settled back against the tree, conserving his strength for what was to come. The engine sounds grew louder. German voices called to each other as soldiers entered the forest, searching for their captain. Jim breathed deeply, calming his mind, accepting what was about to happen. In those quiet moments of waiting, images flashed through his consciousness. The Ohio farm where he'd grown up, his unit preparing for the fateful drop into France. Marie, standing over him with a pistol that first day in her garden. The path that had led him here seemed both random and inevitable, a series of choices and accidents culminating in this final stand in a foreign forest. He had no regrets. The cause he fought for now was more personal, more meaningful than any military objective. These people, this resistance, they had become his true brothers and sisters in arms. The first German soldier appeared between the trees, rifle at the ready. Jim waited until he was close, then fired twice. The soldier dropped. Shouts erupted as the others responded to the gunfire, taking cover and beginning to advance more cautiously. Jim continued firing, precise and economic, making each shot count. One by one, German soldiers fell as they attempted to rush his position, but there were many of them, and they began to coordinate their approach, some providing covering fire while others flanked his position. A bullet struck the tree beside his head. Another grazed his already wounded arm. Jim's vision was beginning to darken at the edges, blood loss taking its toll. Still, he fired methodically, buying precious minutes for Marie and Colette to put distance between themselves and the German forces. When the first pistol clicked empty, Jim switched to the second. When that too was spent, he picked up Dietrich's Luger for a final stand. The Germans were closing in now, their shots coming more frequently as they sensed his weakening resistance. Jim killed 2 more before the Luger's slide locked back on, an empty chamber. In the sudden silence, Jim leaned his head back against the tree, a strange peace settling over him. He had done what he could. Marie and Colette would be safe. The resistance would continue. A German officer appeared from behind a tree, his rifle aimed at Jim's chest. Behind him, more soldiers emerged surrounding the wounded American. "Surrender," the officer commanded in accented English. Jim met his gaze steadily. "I already have," he replied with a faint smile. "Just not to you." The officer's face hardened. He barked an order in German, rifles raised. Jim closed his eyes, a final image of Marie's face filling his mind. The forest erupted with gunfire. 3 days later, Marie stood on a hillside overlooking the valley where their village nestled. Beside her, Colette and Pierre watched in silence as German trucks rumbled along the main road, heading north, retreating. Word had reached them that morning. Allied forces had broken through German lines 30 kilometers to the south. The local, German commanders, Dietrich, now dead, had ordered a strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions. "Is it over?" Colette asked softly. "Not yet," Pierre replied. "The Germans will establish new lines. The fighting will continue. But not here. Not in our valley." Marie remained silent, her gaze fixed on the distant church spire that had somehow survived the fires. Around it, villagers had begun to emerge, tentatively reclaiming their homes and streets. "We should join them," Pierre suggested. "Help rebuild." Marie shook her head slightly. "Not yet. There are still resistance cells that need coordination, supply lines to establish for the Allied advance." Pierre studied her face, understanding the deeper reason behind her reluctance to return. "Marie, about Jim." "I know." She cut him off, not unkindly but firmly. They had found no trace of him when they'd sent scouts back to the ambush site. Only German bodies, and evidence that others had been removed. "We continue the fight. That's what he would want." Colette slipped her hand into her sister's. "He saved us. All of us." "Yes," Marie agreed, squeezing her sister's hand. "And we honor that by continuing what he helped start." As the last German vehicles disappeared over the northern horizon, Marie turned away from the valley. The war wasn't over, not for France, not for Europe, and not for her. But something had shifted, both in the larger conflict and within herself. She, had begun this resistance as a daughter seeking justice for murdered parents. She would continue it as a leader fighting for something larger, for the future Colette and others like her deserved, for the memory of those who had sacrificed everything, and for the fragile flame of humanity that men like Dietrich had tried so hard to extinguish. "Come," she said to her companions. "We have work to do." As they moved away from the overlook, Marie paused briefly, glancing back one last time. Somewhere in that valley, the journey of Sergeant James Holloway had ended. He had fallen from the sky as a soldier following orders, and had died as a man following his conscience. It was, Marie reflected, perhaps the most meaningful transformation the war had yet produced. And in a conflict defined by destruction, such creation, of purpose, of conviction, of loyalty beyond borders, might be the most powerful resistance of all. With that thought to sustain her, Marie turned her face toward the future and walked on, carrying the weight of loss but also the strength of what had been found. The war continued, but so did they. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.